Good morning, everybody. My name's David Rich and I work with Mastercard Advisors. You probably are familiar with Mastercard, particularly with the number of credit and debit cards that our bank issuers issue each year, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the part of the business that I represent is really what we do with the data that comes out of all of those transactions. And that's the part of the business that is really quite fascinating and is really the big data piece of what we're talking about. So it might... Okay, so there's lots of conversations, as you know, about big data. It means all sorts of things to all sorts of people. But unless you can take that big data and manage the data to turn it into little data and gather insights from it, it's useless. A lot of data doesn't really mean anything in and of itself. What matters is what insights can you get from the data that enables you to have a better business strategy, a better return on investment of your marketing spend, a better return on maintaining your client base or growing your client base, or whatever your business objectives are. And the key here with big data is to really understand what problem are you trying to solve with the data. Because big data in and of itself and lots of data doesn't do anything. But if you're trying to solve a problem, that's the first part of the solution, is to understand what it is you want to do with the data, and that will frame ultimately what you get from the data. So, in terms of how does Mastercard look at big data and what's the perspective of big data from our point of view? So our card issuers have issued 2 billion cards. So right now in the world there are 2 billion debit and credit Mastercards issued from 22,000 financial issuers across 200 countries. We process 160 million transactions an hour. That's at least 1.4 billion transactions a year. And the cards are accepted in 38 million merchants worldwide. That's quite amazing, actually, when you look at the amount of data and how we handle that. When each transaction comes in, there's about 600 data elements per transaction. And we apply 700,000 rules and algorithms to each one of those transactions. Some of them are machine-based algorithms, some of them are man-made algorithms. And the reason we do that, and there are 2,000 data scientists who are working across the world apply all those rules and algorithms, is because we need to have clean data. It's not just enough to have big data, because you can't extrapolate and identify propensity to do A, B or C if the data you're using is full of noise and is basically not manageable. So we do a lot of work to identify, is that merchant really the right merchant? Is that transaction the right transaction? And all of those 160 million transactions an hour are processed in an average of 120 milliseconds each. So when you're standing at Carrefour and you swipe the card, that whole transaction going through the issuing bank, the acquiring bank of the merchant itself, and the consumer who's actually making that transaction, all of that happens in 120 milliseconds, 160 million times an hour. Quite an amazing feat. But again, unless we take that data and apply rules and logic to the data to make sure it's clean, we can't really do anything with the data. So that's where we start from. We also don't have, nor do we need, and nor do we want, any personally identifiable information. We don't store it, we don't need it, we don't use it. But what I'm going to take you through is some examples of how we've applied the data to certain industries and certain countries and certain clients of ours and what they do with the data, to give you a perspective on probably the most important thing that everybody really wants to achieve out of the data, which is to monetize it. So we start off with, when we look at all these transactions, there's a lot of noise. So here's all the various categories of expenditure when people swipe their cards, or they put it into the machine, they put their PIN code in, and trying to figure out from that situation, how do I identify one particular transaction out of that I can then take and apply and get some insights from. That process, that procedure, requires a significant amount of capabilities. And the capabilities are not just in storing the data and capturing the data, but also cleaning the data and solving for a problem and making sure that ultimately, once you identify the data and what you want to do with it, you you embed it in a business process and it becomes routine. Because if it doesn't become routine, it doesn't become embedded into your business, it's all going to be a one-off exercise, and you'll be starting from the beginning every time you do the analysis, which you don't really want to do. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of where we apply the data and how companies around the world in all sorts of different industries use the data and help them to monetize it. So here's a graph. One of the things that we do is we look at macroeconomic trends. So we do an analysis in a number of countries around the world. We usually publish the data before the federal governments do in each one of the countries. The United Kingdom, the United States, Brazil, Canada and other countries, for example. And we aggregate all the information into various categories, and we look at total consumer spend. So I'm going to use the example of the United States for no particular reason, and I could use a number of other countries. But in the United States, 70% of GDP comes from consumer spend, right? In Brazil, it's 62.5% is consumer spend that drives the GDP. So understanding consumer expenditure by category and what happens is a really critical function in terms of how your business is operating in the environment that you're operating in. So this graph is, we take the data from a macro perspective and we apply lots of rules and algorithms to it, as I mentioned, and we aggregate it for all forms of tender: cash, check, Visa, Amex, Mastercard, and whatever else is out there, credit, debit. So what you're seeing here is the actual total consumer expenditure in the United States over the last year or so. And you can see it's volatile. It's not static. Consumer expenditure is influenced by numerous things. So if you have a look at the graph here, in February you see the dip, February 2013, and it really fell off a cliff. Why did it fall off a cliff? Because of fiscal policy. In the United States, the payroll tax went up 2% and was applied in February. And that's the impact it had. It also came off the back of 36 consecutive days of increased fuel costs. So people's wallets were being really constricted. In the United States, as in many other economies, the actual average household income is less now than it was in December 2007. And in the United States, the average household income on an inflation-adjusted basis is at the same level as under Richard Nixon in the 1970s. So people's ability for discretionary spend is limited. And when they over-index on one type of category of expenditure, they therefore have to under-index on a different category in order to balance the household budget. So when the taxes go up and when gasoline prices go up or petrol prices go up, consumer spending goes down. And then it starts to recover as people make adjustments. And then you can see in the peak in May and June, it started to taper off again. And that was the key word. That was the time when the Fed, the United States federal banks, were talking about the five-letter magic word, taper. And they were going to stop the free money for all. And so the taper was going to come down. They didn't actually do it, but you can see the impact of just the discussion had on consumer spend. Then it went down, the discussion of taper went away, then it started going back up again, and then towards the beginning of, end of last year and the beginning of this year, you can see it's decreasing in total consumer spend. Why is it decreasing in terms of total consumer spend? There's a lot of discussion. Is the US economy sputtering? Is it working? What's happening? What we saw, because we look at regional breakouts across the world, so in the United States, we knew that in California, in Texas, in Florida, in the sunny states, spending was going up. But 26, 30% of GDP comes out of the northeast in the USA. And if you've been following the weather news, in the USA, in winter, in the northeast, it was particularly brutal and particularly cold. So I live in Connecticut, and it was minus 20, minus 25 Fahrenheit. It was very, very cold, with lots of ice, lots of snow. I wasn't going anywhere, and no one else was either. Right? So a lot of the drive down in consumer spend was literally, it was freezing cold, and so people weren't getting out. You can see at the last month on the column there, it went up because the weather started improving and all that pent-up demand, people started going out again. So a couple of things here. A bar graph in and of itself doesn't mean much. But when you start to thread the insights of what's the consequences of all of that, and if you have any interest in the capital markets, or if you have any interest in how the economy is doing in general, then you can start to see that this can influence the business strategies that you might start to employ. So let me take it down one level. I'm going to look at 2 or 3 other slides and just draw some correlations. We track about 32 sectors. So we track apparel, but within apparel, for example, we track men's, women's, over a certain age, under a certain age. We track online, offline, we do a lot of different things. Here is the hardware spend in the United States. And you can see that most recently it has gone negative. Now, if you're in the hardware industry, if you're in the related industries to hardware, that might be of significant interest to you if you're doing expansion, if you're looking at making investments, if you're looking at inventory management, right? Because if consumer spend is going down, you might be stuck with a lot of inventory. So it has business consequences. And you can see at the very end there, it goes up. Why? Because the weather started getting much, much better, and people like me, over the winter, things break, and we don't repair them because it's too cold outside. When the weather gets good, we go outside and we don't do the basic repairs. So that's, you can see that the spend on hardware went down. At the same time, you can also see the spend on furniture went down. So this is a graph of, I said we track many different verticals. So here's a graph of furniture and furnishings. Typically, people buy furnishings, pillows, throw rugs, things of that nature, when they are just refreshing the house. And people buy new furniture when they're buying a new house. So now we start to see the correlation between, if I'm in one of these industries, I might want to be aware of what's going on in the economy in various countries at any one time. But we can see hardware sales going down, we can see furniture sales, which is usually associated with home purchase. And then we have a look at what happened to housing turnover in the United States. It went down. So we don't track housing turnover from consumer spend. This is a graph of extraneous sort of information from the environment. But housing and turnover here is new house sales and existing houses resold, both new construction and existing. So total sales. It went down. So we could see, we were calling that the housing market was cooling off in the United States 6 months before anyone else in the United States was calling it. Because we could see the consumer spend patterns that are correlated to housing in hardware, in furniture, and other types of industry sectors and verticals going negative year on year. And where the consumer spend drives such a significant amount of GDP, it makes a very, very big difference. A lot of companies use this for all sorts of different reasons, right? Some do it for their business strategy and in terms of expansion. We track luxury, we track a whole variety of sectors, as I mentioned. And in the luxury sector, there's really only one country that's spending on luxury right now, and that's in the United States. So if you're looking at expanding luxury retail, you might want to consider where in the United States, as opposed to other countries, you might want to make that investment, because that's where the spend is occurring. So we track all of that, and it has business consequences that companies can use to help drive a return on their investments. We do a lot of other things too. So, for example, so that's on the macro side. And then as we move towards more of the, that's knowing the environment that you're working in, benchmarking against the environment, and then how do you act on that, and what is it you want to do? So lots of companies understand how much customers spend with them. So we work with department stores, we work with retailers and all sorts of industries, and they'll all know, yes, my best customers spend $10,000 a year with me, and I've got a number of these customers, and I want to retain them, and I want to treat them very special. Of course, fantastic. Until we come along and say, well, that customer number one that spends $10,000 a year with you is actually spending $30,000 a year on the competitive category. So you're only getting 1/3 of the spend of that customer. And the other customer, who also spends $10,000 a year with you, is spending $10,100 on the competitive category. So you've got 95% of that spend. Would you want to promote to them the same way, knowing that you've only got 1/3 of spend of one and 95% of the other, when they both spend the same amount with you? So we can see through the data and how we apply the data and how we clean the data, we can see what your customers are spending with your competition. And then we can relay that back without any personally identifiable information from Mastercard's point of view, but working with the retailer or working with the client, they do have the personally identifiable information, and they can match the records at their end to identify who is spending what and how that's working. That has a lot of implication for return on investment of marketing spend. A lot of money is spent on retaining customers. we're trying to give insights as to which customers should you really be spending that money on, because they're not all the same. So we do a lot of work like that, and that has a lot of economic benefit for a lot of companies, and they make a significant amount of return on that investment. We also do other types of analysis, and I'm only going to go through 3 or 4 examples. I don't have a huge amount of time, and I could talk literally all day about all the sorts of things that we could do. This is an example. We worked with an airline company, a major airline company, and they wanted to understand how was their affiliation working with the rental car company that they had a partnership with. So we did an analysis. The first box, the 20%, that's the partner that they have. So airline, number 1, car company number 1, they have a partnership. 20% of the airline customers spent with car company number 1, the partner. 40% of the same airline customer base spent it with car company number 2, not the partner. So if I'm running a partnership in an airline, I'd probably want to know that, because it looks to me that partnership is probably not working as well as it could. Maybe I want to go and work with the card issuer if there's a loyalty program through a card rewards company, and try and promote to car company number 1. Maybe I want to change affiliations from car company number 1 to car company number 2. So we do that type of analysis. Again, it has a very significant impact on return on investment, on monetising the relationships. I mean, it's basically data-informed insights. But it's the insights that lead to business decisions, that ultimately investments are made from which we need to get the return. And this is going to help identify where to focus. Another example, we do a lot of work around the world with various merchants. So merchants can see how much money is being spent on each store. So we work with restaurants, we work with hardware companies and all sorts of different industries where they say, excuse me, where they'll say, oh, this store in Bristol or wherever it may be is losing sales year on year, it's not doing very well. Until we do an analysis that shows, well, actually, in the competitive set, the share of spend through that store is actually much higher than it was compared to the competition in the trade area of that store. So if there's 5 competitors within a 5-mile radius of that particular store, and spending in that whole area is going down, but the store in question here is maintaining its share or growing its share, to the store owner, it looks like sales are going down year on year, but actually that store manager is really managing that store very well, and in a declining market is increasing share. It's a view that a retailer can't often get with extraneous data about what is the market share from a spend perspective, right? They can't get that. And we can do that at a store level, at a regional level, at a state level, at a country level, at a regional level. There's all sorts of levels where we can do it at a national level, and we can do it from for the rolled up for all the stores, or down to a specific individual store. So looking at competitive spend and market share from a spend perspective is a very different proposition than store-on-store, year-on-year sales, because it gives context. Again, benchmarking against what's going on with the competitions from a spend point of view, what's going on in terms of the economy, and how you're benchmarking against those. We also do work, this was some work that we did for an electronics company that wanted to identify people who had a propensity to buy electronics. They didn't want to do direct mail, they didn't want to do TV or radio, they wanted to do digital execution. So we identified people who have a propensity to buy electronics online based on our propensity modelling of we see all the online transactions, and we see what the people do buy and the types of other things that they do in their day-to-day spending that indicate that this group of people, this cohort of people, are more likely to spend on electronics online than this group of people. And we created a digital environment for them to be able to market to those people who have a likely propensity to buy electronics online, who are not currently buying or only buying minimally online from them. And in this particular case, we grew the return on investment by 400 basis points, which is huge if you understand the marketing digitally. To get a 400 basis point return on investment is, when usually it's only a 10 or 15 basis point investment, is really quite significant. So targeting the people with the propensity to buy your goods and services based on actual spend is really critical, because we believe that the best predictor of purchasing behaviour is purchasing behaviour. my last example, before I sort of hand it over to the next speaker, we do a lot of cross-border analysis as well, amongst numerous other things, right? But I thought I'd just give these 3 or 4 examples. Now, for cross-border, this particular analysis was done in the Asia Pacific for a company. They wanted to understand, when travellers come in from out of market from different countries, who are they? How much do they spend? So you can see in this chart that the number one foreigners who come into the country in question, into this store, right, in question, is from New Zealand. 32% of all travel are New Zealanders, okay, into this particular store in this particular country. Fantastic. But they spend on average $270. You go over to the right of that chart and you'll see China. Now, China only makes up 9%, but they spend $460 odd. Now, if I have a marketing budget and I'm marketing to foreign travellers, I probably want to market to foreign travellers where I'm underrepresented and they have a high ticket spend. So maybe China is where I should be placing a few more bets in my marketing dollar as opposed to New Zealand, because I've already got significant market share. So that's one part of the analysis. Another part of the analysis is how is that spend distribution compared to your competitors? So this is 32% of people coming into your store are from New Zealand. They spend on average $270. Do you want to know how many New Zealanders and other countries come into your competitor's store and what's the average ticket that they spend? And how do you benchmark against them? Would that give you some insights as to how you might want to invest your money and how you might want to get a return on your investment? And then we can take it one step further and have a look at when they're not shopping with you, so when the New Zealanders come into your store in your country, what else do they buy that's not competitive? What restaurants do they eat in? What else do they spend their money on? You may want to have that information, because if you're going into a mall, you might want to know, you might want to put your store next to the number one store that they go and buy in that's not competing with you after they finish buying with you. So there's a huge amount of correlated activity that we can help identify that can give the businesses insights into making informed decisions upon which they're going to make investments and then get a return on that investment. And we've seen again and again and again of the significant increase in return on investment that we can help drive with our partners and with our clients. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and next guest up.